Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining David and myself. Today, we're going to talk about Sutherland Council. About 2 months ago, we had a chat with Woollahra Council, and today we've gone down south and talking to David in Sutherland Council. So just a few housekeeping things. If you don't mind muting your Zoom, but keeping your video open so we can at least see that you're there. There is a chat box. I think everyone by now knows how to use Zoom. So if you do have a question, David or myself will come back to that question at the end. We won't take too much time. We'll go for around 30 minutes. And there will be a session at the end, as I said before, for Q&A. I will say, though, if it's a specific question about your DA in Sutherland Council, maybe now's not the time to ask David. But if it's a general question about Sutherland Council or anything else, this is certainly the forum to do that. Just an overview of what we're going to be covering today. So I'm going to start first. I'll talk for about the first 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to share with you two main things: the DA approval process, how we treat each project for clients, basically, and I'm happy to share it with you. And then just going through more of a high-level overview of the council issues and also obviously the economic issues associated with DAs. Then I'll hand it over to David, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Now you'll see this image on the bottom right. It might be from a scene of Braveheart. I don't know where I found it, but often we feel like we're having a bit of a battle between us versus council. Today I want to try break down those barriers and kind of open up a dialogue. So it's not just a one-way street over here, it's a two-way street. Just a brief spiel about what we do now on planning. We have projects in around 26 councils at the moment. Have been going on for almost 10 years now and get involved with a wide range of projects across not just Sydney, but also New South Wales. So the DA approval process. Now, this is something we hand out to all potential clients, not just clients, but potential clients too. Kind of summarizes a typical flow for a DA. Everyone has their own processes for business, whether you're, selling shoes or you're an online marketer. For us, this process or this flow chart works really well. You could probably break it down into maybe 20 different steps, but here it's only in about 7 steps or so. Now you can see the core, or a lot of the focus is around preparing a DA, mainly because the old phrase, garbage in, garbage out. If you put in a DA that's mediocre or missing critical information on the plans or the reports, then it's going to bounce back to you and you're going to have issues down the track. The second column in this flowchart talks about once you've lodged the DA, generally we monitor the progress with council. We don't just let it sit in council. And where there's issues, there usually are issues, either trivial or significant. Hopefully they're not too significant, then we're in there to bat for the clients. And after the process, that's hopefully not too long, especially if you lodge a DA in Sutherland Council, you get your DA approved. Because I tell people councils are not in the business of refusing DAs. They're here to approve DAs, believe it or not. So we're all here, in the same boat, trying to achieve the same result, really. So just a high-level review of the economic issues associated with DAs. I think these are quite self-explanatory. We've got the cost of building. So builders are going out of business. You've got high inflation. For the economy, that's not that's an obvious thing. You also have rising interest rates, which obviously it's affecting everybody, and low unemployment rates. I'm not an economic expert, but from what I understand, that's quite unusual in this economic environment that we're living in at the moment. So this is something certainly to keep in the back of our minds, especially when we have clients that might be a mum or dad. They might not be a developer, but mums and dads certainly are feeling the hit in terms of the economy. And obviously they want their DAs approved as quickly as possible so that they can lock in a builder and their costs. So these are the issues that I've just highlighted with councils. I might be able to put maybe 10 slides here for the purpose of today, but I'm not going to do that. But here, just a summary of the issues. Council's controls are not really easy to interpret, even for us as town planners or architects or other consultants in this Zoom. You can read one line of the LEP or DCP and have somebody else interpret it differently based on my experience with these things. This also happens within councils themselves, which further complicates things for the process. Councils are now asking for a lot more documentation than they used to. If you were to do a review or a GIPA of an old DA that was lodged maybe 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, you'll see the level of documentation was pretty small. You have a few sets of plans, a very basic SCE, and that's it. Now the councils are asking for a lot more information. In some respects, it's not a huge issue, but it's kind of consistent with where we're up to in 2023, where you've got technology that you can survey a building with a 3D laser and scan every little crack on the building. So councils are asking for a lot more information, which generally is okay, I think. Then we all have, I guess, experiences, let's say, with the planning portal. I recently heard through an architect's email group, some of you might be on that, where someone said Georges River, which is obviously Sutherland Council's neighbour, also a council that I used to work at, they're sometimes taking up to 8 weeks to formally lodge a DA. I'm not just blaming Georges River here, I'm just using it as an example. So it is an issue just to get a DA lodged and formally into the system. There's obviously a risk of an appeal. So the minute if you need to lodge an appeal against a DA, whether it's has been sitting in council for a while or it's refused, what that does is that consumes council's resources significantly. So by you thinking that you're going to be skipping the queue, you will, but then council's going to be even slower with other projects or other DAs they're assessing because of this appeal. So it's kind of, it affects everybody. And then there's delays associated with referrals. So if you need to remove a tree, that has to go to a different department within council, etc., etc. I shared this screen in the last webinar that we hosted in Woollahra Council. So this is something I found on Sydney Morning Herald. Gives you a list of all the DA, I guess, let's say the worst councils refusing DAs back in 2021. Ironically, one of the smallest councils is Hunters Hill, and Strathfield is also a very small council. Except when you go down to the bottom of the list, you've got Sutherland Council. So they've refused only 5% of their DAs, and they dealt with 1,446 DAs in 2021, whereas Hunters Hill only dealt with 116 DAs. So you can see, something's not right here, except David might allude to it later on in his discussion that Sutherland Council in those days were letting DAs go on forever and ever, whereas now I believe they've tightened things up a bit, which is good. This other slide just gives you all of this stuff. What I'm showing is available online. It's not a secret. So if you just, for example, Google New South Wales planning, performance dashboard, you'll be able to look at this slide as well as a whole bunch of other statistics. But these statistics basically highlight for the Metro Sydney councils that if you look to the far right column, talks about what happened in 2020, 2021. So the average time frame for DAs was 110, which was pretty good, I think. Then it's come down or gone up to 136. And as of this financial year, which is only almost 3 months, 2 months, it's gone up to 148. So obviously we can't really rely on just 2 months worth of data for this financial year, but you can see there's a bit of a trend going the wrong way. This slide is also on the dashboard, which is quite useful. Just summarizes, I'm not going to go into detail, you can look at it yourself later. Just comparing the DAs that have been lodged or determined and compared to previous years. And I guess the common thread is that things are taking a lot longer than they should be. This is a quote that I saw over the weekend. I don't know if you saw it. It was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald by the new planning boss, Kirsten Fishburne. I'll read it out to you just quickly because I think we can learn a lot from it. She says, a lot of the dodgy has come out of the system. We had a few bad decades in the planning system in terms of integrity. So you tighten all the screws down really hard, but they're tied too hard at the moment. If I can loosen some of those screws, we will get more development interest in New South Wales because we will be faster and we will be more certain, and I will get more housing. So hopefully she's right, and hopefully we get some real quick action. Again, this is the state government who should be directing things at the moment. I'll just finish off with this last slide. So there was a survey that was prepared by a group called Astrolab Group. I was actually involved with just spreading the word on LinkedIn and just trying to get more traction. So the results are in. So they had 158 respondents, and there was a whole bunch of comments by different people. You can see here there was a planning consultant and a planning officer working in a council, so different perspectives. There is a link at the bottom, or if you just want to Google Pulse of Planning, you'll be able to see a bit more results from that survey. So I hope that is good for you. Obviously, if you have any questions about this part of the presentation, we can discuss it later, but I will now hand over to David. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Ellie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Milliken. I'm the Director of Planning here at Sutherland Shire. And I can see there's a few familiar names on the list of people there. So hi to those who I know and to those who I haven't met yet. It's nice to meet you all. As Ellie said, I'm just going to talk about, I've got about 6 or 7 slides. I'm just going to talk briefly for about 10 or 15 minutes about some of the changes we're making here at Sutherland Shire. Not really going to get into too much of the technical ins and outs of some of the issues, but really talk about holistically some of the changes that we're making here. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I will. Can we all see that? So used to using Teams and sharing screens, when you switch to Zoom, you forget how to do it. So I guess this slide here really shows the number of DAs that we have on hand that we've had under assessment. And I think what the slide really shows is that those DAs were really piling up. Where we had a number of issues underlying that, but very high number of DAs on hand. We liked when we're running well, with the number of staff we've got, around 300 to 350 DAs is a good number to have to be working with. We saw them pile up to almost 3 times that amount around the middle of last year. And that led to a high workload for individual officers. It led to really slow processing times. We even had around 300 DAs that were sitting on the portal that we couldn't even allocate to officers because of the amount of work that officers were going on. And of course, that all leads to your poor customer experience, poor reputation, and all of that. I guess there are a number of underlying reasons for that. Sutherland, I guess we haven't reviewed our development assessment process for a long period of time. We've had, I guess, a process that when something's gone wrong, we just added patches to it and sort of built on, and we've ended up with quite a cumbersome assessment process. We also had a large number of development applications come in at the tail end of the COVID period. I think with everybody, I don't know, but I suppose I surmise that everybody sitting at home for 2.5, 3 years, all of a sudden decided it's time for their extension or time for their knockdown rebuild. Around 80% of our applications are, single residential additions and alterations. We're a very residential area. And we had a large number of those applications come in over that period of time. And I think the other thing Ellie alluded to, councils that have a high number of refusals, and Sutherland's on the lower end of that. And while that sounds really good, it's actually part of the problem. We have DAs that we just didn't make decisions on for a long period of time. We kept working with applicants to get the DA into a state where it could be approved. But some of them took 7, 8, 9, even more sets of plans until we got it to that stage. And I think we've got one at the moment that's up to 14 sets of plans, and we just need to get to a decision on that one. So we had a really big backlog or really big workload of DAs and a significant backlog that was causing issues for ourselves, for our customers, for the councillors, for everybody involved in that process. So that really was the story of 2022. And in December 2022, council, off the back of a report going to council to deal with a customer, a community engagement strategy, that was really their councillors saying, look, we need to do something about this problem. And council decided to engage a consultant who are Procure Spot to really look at our development assessment process, to pull it all apart and package it all back together. But of course, that's a 12 to 24 month project to look at coming up with a whole brand new process. So in the meantime, we had to work out how we're going to deal with this issue that we've got. And there were really two main things that we wanted to attack to start with. One was this 300 development applications that hadn't even been assessed, allocated to officers for assessment. So that's, Ellie referred to Georges River that had about an 8-week period for allocation. In Sutherland, we were talking, 6 months to get an application allocated to officers. So what we really wanted to do was by 30th of June, make sure we'd allocated all of those DAs from 2022 and that they were all under assessment and that we didn't have an unallocated backlog anymore. So that was the goal for the 2022 applications. Then for the 2023 applications, we introduced a new model following the New South Wales Government's best practice guide. The aim was to bring to assess our 2023 DAs on an average of 40 days, which is sort of the minister's expectations, and it's sort of what that best practice guide talks about, an average of 40 days. So really the new applications coming in, we would assess under a new set of rules. Essentially, we're giving people 1 or 2 chances on their revised plans to meet the requirements, and then we'd be making a decision. With the 2022 ones, the goal was to get them all allocated to officers and under assessment. So that was really the decision that we made to sort of attack the problem head on. But then we also had to work out what is our more sustainable way of reviewing, refining, and implementing a much better practice for our assessments. And we really looked at that in three sort of themes, if you like. One theme really around our process and our policy associated with that. So that's the work ProcureSpot are doing at the moment, is looking at our process, but also looking at what our policies are, and making sure our policies are aligned to the process that we want, and getting good outcomes for our customers. Secondly, really looking at our people, making sure we've got the right people in the right place, and we've got the right resources to work with the number of applications that we get and the type of applications that we get. Ellie also referred to internal referrals, and every council I've worked at, internal referrals have always been one of the issues. Making sure that the experts in engineering or landscape or architecture are resourced appropriately to feed into that process. There's no point us having a quick development assessment process when it takes 4 months to get an architectural referral back. So making sure we've got the right people in the right places to do that. And then also making sure we've got the right technology in place. So councils moving to the Technology One council platform, which is a great piece of technology for councils. But specific functions, maybe it's not as good at. So we have to make sure that when we're configuring that, we're getting the best out of that for our updated process. So really, this sort of shows, this slide here really shows the reduction in that unallocated development applications from 2022. You see that very quickly came down from almost 350 by focusing our efforts on getting them allocated to officers. By the end of June, we had that particular problem fully addressed. So people were no longer waiting 6 months for an application to be allocated to an officer. They were waiting, you get it submitted on the portal within a week or two, having that on an officer's desk under assessment. So very quickly doing that, and we implemented I think it happens twice a week, an allocations meeting, where applications that come in off the portal are allocated quickly to officers. You can also see that the blue line, sort of the processing time for 2023 DAs. Of course, as more 2023 DAs get resolved, that number is trending upwards. But we're still, kind of around that average of 40 days. I think at the moment it's just crept up to close to 50. But that's just as the year progresses, you're going to have some of those older DAs get resolved. Long story short, that's much better than where we were looking at, 6 months to be allocated an officer, then another 6 to 9 months for a resolution. So things are much better than what they were now, but that's not to say there's not a lot of work still to be done. So the DAs on hand, this is really a good indicator of our workload. Peaked at 819 mid last year. That's now down below 600. It's coming down to close to 550 now. And that really means that individual officers have a much less of a caseload. They have more ability to work on the applications they've got and provide that level of service to our customers. So when Ellie calls and asks, when he's actively managing his DAs and he calls, we've actually got time to return his call and talk to him and work with our customers on those on issues associated with those DAs. So we're starting to see those early improvements in our reputation and the experience of our customers. Still a long way to go, but early improvements in that space are quite good. So this slide here really it spells out the amount of work that's still to be done. Whilst we've allocated the backlog and we've introduced those best practice guidelines, we still have a high number of DAs on hand, about 550. About half of them are unresolved ones from 2022. So we're still having to work through, it's not a backlog of unallocated DAs now, it's a backlog of DAs that are allocated to people. So we've kind of moved on to the next problem, if you like. But we know there are underlying process inefficiencies. Our process is very cumbersome, and we're working with ProcureSpot to unpack that whole process and then repackage it in a much lighter, if you like, assessment process, and hopefully that will mean faster from end-to-end processing times. For example, we don't, when an application gets lodged on the portal, our e-planners assess that to make sure it's lodgement ready, so that when it gets allocated to an officer, it can quickly move on. What was happening previously, they were basically doing a mini assessment and making sure that was, in good order to be approved before it was even allocated off the portal. That means we're assessing something twice. We don't want to be doing that. And that's just an example of an inefficiency that we've had to resolve. Now we have our e-planners make sure that the application on the portal is assessment ready. So all the information is there. There's nothing glaringly obvious that needs to be provided. If it meets those requirements, it gets lodged and allocated to a planner. Whereas before, they were almost assessment before they got to that stage. So really coming up with a much lighter, if you like, assessment process. We also have Civity on board, and they're reviewing matters that have gone to the LEC to see if there's any issues in those particular cases that could have been resolved at an earlier stage. If there's any consistency in that we can look at. We've got a new leadership team on board in the planning space, and that's a bit of our I guess people theme. We're commencing lifting that growth in customer experience. We've still got some reputational issues, and me presenting to this group is part of working through some of that reputation issue. And we're bringing people along on that culture change, because we're changing the way that we do planning. It's so important that you bring people with you. We don't want to end up in a situation where we've got industrial issues because we've changed too quickly. We want to make sure we're doing everything, in good order, in a reasonable pace, but then that people can keep up with those changes. And as I mentioned, we're moving to the One Council platform. So at the moment, we're starting to work on that ERP configuration. Where we expect to be in 12 months' time, we expect the DA numbers to be quite coming down to that manageable 300 to 350 level. Probably being a little bit conservative and staying around 400, so we don't overcommit. Old story, try and undercommit and over deliver. So if we can get that down to 300, between 300 and 400, we're doing quite well in that caseload area. And the lower we get that number, the more capacity we have to serve our customers better, to speed up the assessments we have underway, and to implement the process changes. So we look at those process changes starting in November. It's probably a 6-month period to bring all of them in. And part of that will be embedding the best practice guidelines in all of our policy and all of our procedures. We hope to be reporting the outcomes of Procure Spot in the near future. And that contract, if you like, is really what's going to outline what our process changes are going to be. And we also have the report from Civity coming back shortly around our LEC matters. In terms of our people, making sure we've got our resources aligned to our new process. And then it's all about continuous improvement in our customer service and our reputation. And then by mid next year, we'll have the One Council system coming online, and that will really be the opportunity to make sure that our technology aligns with our process. So that will be good integration with the planning portal, good integration with our DA tracker and our neighbour notification community engagement portals. Having everything on the one system will really help from that technology point of view. So I think although we've had some good wins, it's a steady process to turn the ship around. The statistics are telling a good story, but people are still saying, calling up, where's my DA? It's taking too long. And DAs are, particularly those ones from 2022, they're still taking too long. We've still got a bit of work to get through to bring those numbers down. So while driving the numbers down is really important, maintaining the focus on those underlying issues, that's just as important as well. Bringing in that new process and that underlying inefficiency, addressing that's really important. I think what was also important was make a decision to resolve the issues. If we kept just working through things in the order they were received, I don't think we would have been able to work through that unallocated backlog as quickly as we did. And whilst that does mean that applications that were received in 2023 were assessed faster than ones received in 2022. It did mean that for 6 months we had to ride through that period of time. So people might say that's a bit of inequity, and that's probably a fair point. But it did mean we had to pick a way of addressing the problem in so it was addressed sustainably for the long run. The area where we could have done a lot better in that space was communication, explaining what we were doing and why we were doing it. So, I mean, I think that was probably a bit of a lesson for us is, selling the story, telling people why we're doing it. We could have done that much better. So if other councils, I don't know if there are any other council planners on the call, but if there are, that's one bit of feedback I'd say if you were going to go down this sort of path. And I think we all know the next point. Our planning system is, ever complexifying. The planning portal is supposed to be a way of doing business better, and at face value, it is. But the complexities associated with the planning portal one of the issues associated with it. Like every council has a different back-end software system, and the portal doesn't necessarily speak well to those systems. So one of our outcomes is when one council comes online is to get that good alignment and that close integration between the portal and our back-end software. And I think the main point here, and this probably refers back to Ellie's slide from Braveheart, understanding of industry is really crucial. That's why I feel it's important that I come here and speak to this group, let you know what we're doing, how we're attacking the problem, because we don't want this us and them situation between the industry and councils. We're all trying to get good outcomes. We're all working towards the same thing. There are hurdles that councils have to overcome. And I think industry understanding some of them is important and will be helpful to resolve, some of the differences between industry and council. And that's really it from me. So I wanted to give enough time for lots of questions. So fire away.
Thanks, David. That was really, really interesting. I probably didn't introduce you properly at the beginning of the presentation, but for people that don't know, David comes from Perth and has been involved with a variety of different councils. So he's got that experience that obviously Sutherland Council deserves. One of the points, David, that you mentioned was you were talking about your customers. Councils is a business effectively too. So you have your customers. Some council officers might forget that. So I think that's a really valid point that you made. A couple of questions, actually. I'll probably just start off. When you talk about the manageable number of DAs being 300, 350, what does that mean, firstly? And secondly, how many DAs does each council officer deal with at any time?
I'll answer those two questions separately.
Yeah.
I think the first one, it's really around, what sort of caseload can we carry with our resources that we can provide a good level of service for each of those cases that we have. Obviously, when you have 1,000 cases on your books, you've only got so many minutes per week. Allocating those minutes to each case is very, very difficult. When that number comes down to a more manageable number, then you have more hours in the week to allocate to each of them. We can better proactively service our customers. So pick up the phone and say, hey, we haven't heard from you in 2 weeks about that RFI. Do you have any difficulty? Can we help in any way? Whereas before we simply could not do that. And then applications per officer, well, that really varies. It depends on a variety of things, the level of that officer, the complexity of the cases they're carrying, whether they're a team leader, they may have more because they're looking after a bigger portfolio, or they may have less because they've got complicated applications that their teams are dealing with. So it really varies. We're looking at an average per officer of around 15 to 17 as a reasonable caseload. Some officers have up to 25. Some of the more junior ones would have less than 10. It really depends. I think the things that's changed, though, over the 20 20 odd years or so I've been doing this, DAs have become more complex. Those simple ones, the simple DAs that used to take 4 days, a week, 2 weeks, they're now deemed deemed or compliant. They're off the books. We don't deal with them. We now only dealing with more and more complex applications. In Sutherland, a lot of our residential applications are around the foreshore area, where there's that arguments between development and maintaining environment. So they're complicated. And as you know, everybody has an opinion on everything these days. So applications, when we notify them, invariably we get objections to them. One of the things that we're looking at is how can we do more fast track applications, reduce the notification. But our community really wants to know what's going on because they really want to have their say. So, I mean, I guess all of those things are meaning that applications are getting more complex. And although planners might have less applications on their books, they're more complex applications.
Thank you. Does anybody else have other questions? Or you can put into the chat, whatever you feel more comfortable doing.
I'll speak up, Eli.
If
that's okay.
Go for it.
My name's Stephen Last. I'm a development manager at Abacus Storage King. Eli and David, thanks for facilitating this presentation. I took interest in it because we've secured a parcel of land in the Shire, and we haven't undertaken any developments in that jurisdiction as of yet. But I thought it was interesting that you shared the experiences in the Georges River Council. We are one of those statistics at the moment. I think we lodged our application there in October, or August actually, and I think it was 2 days before Christmas that we were finally accepted on the portal, and I think only last month we received some RFIs to amend our development. But I guess our line of work relates to storage kings and self-storage facilities, and we've got multiple applications across Sydney, and we're having various approaches to how councils would interpret specific nuances that relate to GFA in particular, and how that works within existing height controls and DCP boundaries and the like. I'm particularly excited to see that your improvements are around processing times and the like. I guess, is there any way that we could collaborate with council, or what opportunities are there to collaborate with council to best submit an application that is or has better prospects of going through a much cleaner pathway? And the reason I ask is, often, like using the Georges River example, the RFI we received related to the GFA, and we had to substantially change the massing of our building 9 months after the event. That was all. And I guess in our experiences in the past, we've used the pre-DA process to commence some engagement, but we're often just confronted with a black and white recital of the controls that exist on the site. But in our use in particular, we can be very compliant with height and envelope, but we chew up a lot of GFA very quickly. And in an industrial setting, it just seems a little bit, it seems like an underutilized site. And I'd love to be able to sit down with council and to sort of talk it through and understand, if we were to go down the clause 4.6 path, the variance might seem like a significant exceedance, but there's a lot of good merit behind it.
Yeah, a lot of good questions in that one. I'll try and answer it pretty quickly. I was going to talk briefly around the pre-DA process. As part of our best practice introduction, we did introduce a pre-DA process, but the challenge with that is you need to be able to resource it. So again, the more that our caseload comes down, the more we can allocate resources to the pre-DA process, and actually do that properly. So we're not just, as you say, reciting the controls. You guys already know that. We're actually giving you an indication of what we would like to see in an application. And then also doing that in such a way that whatever we provide in the pre-DA is going to be consistent in the DA process. So you don't just get a letter and then you lodge an application and the RFI says something completely different. We've all seen that happen. So we want to make sure that we're doing that pre-DA process properly. So I would encourage to come in your case, come in for a pre-DA. Ellie will have my email details. So you can contact me. We can set that up. Or you can go onto our website and all the information's there, of course. So there's that part of it. The other part of it, I guess, is around the consistency of interpretation. And I don't mean necessarily between councils, but I mean within the same council. When it comes to 4.6s, if you don't need one and you tick the boxes, happy days, off you go. But when you bring in a 4.6, it can, like I said, most of our applications relate to housing, so they're all quite similar. But when something comes in an industrial area, it's often quite different, and the officer might have a different view from the team leader, from the manager, from if it goes to a panel, different views on that all the way through. Something I would like to introduce further down the track is a bit of an improved governance model around 4.6s, so that we can have a consistent approach to them, and whether that's a little panel that gets together regularly once a week or whatever, looks at the 4.6s that we've got and sort of makes a judgment call on have they pushed the boundary too far, or they're quite reasonable. The good news is most of the 4.6s that we get do go through. We still do have quite a low refusal rate, even though we are obviously, by making more decisions, we're going to have more refusals. That naturally follows. But we still do have quite a good approval rate. For me, it's about the quality of the RFI that goes out. Picking what the issues are, not listing the 25 things that might be wrong with it, but the 3 or 4 things that are showstoppers that we need to address in that RFI. Then, of course, doing that clearly, doing that in such a way that the customer can come back with a response to it without reading and going, what does all this mean? Really, in our letters, nailing what the issue is. And if it doesn't make sense, then meeting with the applicant. Whereas when you've got, like I said, when you've got 1,000 DOs on your book, you're just trying to get the RFIs out as quickly as you can. You don't have the opportunity to meet with people. So for me, bringing down that caseload is the key, because that will create the capacity to do these improvements that we'd like to do elsewhere. It's a bit of a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think I got there.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'm sure you'll see Stephen soon for a pre-DA. Are you doing pre-DAs, David, face-to-face or on Zoom?
Oh, it depends. What we can do both. Now that we've got no COVID restrictions, we like to see people.
I'd love to do it face-to-face. It's painful.
We have meeting rooms, so we're happy to do that. But then again, we also know that sometimes the applicant is in a different physical place from the customer. And there are efficiencies by having Zoom meetings. And one of the investments we've made here is making sure that all of our meeting rooms are technologically capable of doing that. There's nothing worse than walking into a meeting room and someone's joining on Teams and there's no screen. So we're making sure that we've got both options available, because I think that's important in this day and age.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Any other questions for David?
Yeah, hi David, it's James Watt-Smith, architect.
Hi, James.
Ellie, how are you?
Good.
I'm just curious, if it's changed or not. I did a 5 townhouse development over a basement a few years ago, and we did a pre-DA meeting, and the planning requirements in terms of the definition of your GFA was very, very different to the planner who actually did the final assessment. In particularly around the stairwell and the voids and stuff like that. It was just a very complicated answer we got, whereas it was completely different when we did the actual approval or the submission process. Just wonder if you could clear up what your definition of GFA really is.
I'm reluctant to give a definition on this call because I don't get involved in that on a day-to-day basis. But what I would say is what we've done is brought in a new management team. We had a number of managers that have been here for a long period of time and they moved on, and the positions were vacant for quite a while. We've now filled all of them. I started here back in the start of the year. I've brought on a new senior manager, a new management team. And one of the themes that we've been drilling down is consistency, and making sure that things just like the definition of GFA or whatever it might be, that we're being consistent in the way we apply the LEP, the DCP, and the other requirements that we have. What we want to move forward to is good documentation, so that all of our planners, all of our supports, all of everybody working in development services has a good reference to go back to, because that's something we don't have. So having a good procedure manual. Other places where I've worked, we've had this thing called the Bible, where you get stuck, you just go to it. It would have the definition of GFA in there, but also how we interpret that, and some consistent approach in that. But also have a way of, when things are getting stuck, escalating it up. That's reasonable. That we don't get stuck in this loop where the planner from council and the planner from the applicant just disagree, and because they don't disagree, they can't move forward. We have ways now of escalating and resolving and moving that stuff forward. But I would say that, again, in my 20 odd years of doing this, the definition of GFA has changed so many times. Different places and different states and different areas do it differently. But even different interpretations within the same council has been a problem. So floor area is a prickly one.
This variation seemed to be hinged around the fact of whether the stairs itself are included on the first floor or whether they're supposed to be part of a void area. And that was primarily the difference between the pre-DA assessment and the actual planner who looked after the application.
Yeah, and so in that case, if the architect or the applicant was concerned around that, we'd allow the question to be asked in the pre-DA, we'd answer it in the pre-DA, and then the letter that goes back to the customer would then be the letter that's referred to. Application comes in. That would be the way that we'd like to do stuff.
Yeah, there was an LEC case I was involved in, different project in Engadine, and it was hinged around the definition of GFA. And it was exactly that, whether the stairs are included on the first floor or the second floor, or not. And the ruling that the judgment came through was that it's a void area. It's not. You don't include the stairs. So that was something that was documented a few years back.
Yeah, and I think that usually that is the outcome. But again, like the point I made before around, is that actually the issue associated with it? Are we looking? Are we using that as a way to find a refusal? Maybe in that case we were. But is that really is the GFA really the issue at hand?
I think from an architectural point of view, it's just a matter of knowing what the guidelines and the rules are so that we can design something that obviously complies. Because when we submit something to council, we obviously want to try and make sure it ticks all the boxes in terms of the DCP and the LEP, and that we don't have any sort of unforeseen things that crop up. So that's why consistency, I think, is probably a great way forward. So.
Well, what I might suggest is, obviously on the architectural plans you show how you've calculated GFA. Sometimes there's difference of opinions in councils. So what I've done in the past is I've asked the council, can you please show me how you've worked out your calculations? And they've sent it through, and we've been able to work out, okay, we were 2 square meters short or more, whatever the case may be. So that's always...
Well, Elliot didn't come up in the actual planning side of it. It didn't, as I said, in the pre-DA, we were told to include the stairs in the area, but with the actual approval process, it wasn't included. So it was 4 square meters that we could have added back into the building that we wouldn't have done.
And it's precious. Every square meter is precious, especially...
Well, when you've got 5 townhouses, that's what 3 square meters that you can add back in. So it's very important.
Well, what happens too is in the background, there's always these court cases. There might be a few every year that councils are looking at. in terms of, okay, so the court case said this, and now we have to respond to calculate FSR differently, or perhaps let's assess building height differently. So there's always these
And
things.
that's one of the complications of the New South Wales planning system, is that it is much more legally geared than other jurisdictions. In Western Australia, the tribunal is part of the, similar to NCAT, it's part of the SAT. So it's much less adversarial. You go in there and you work through things, and you come to a resolution without it having to be a judge making a decision at the end of the day that has a legal implication. Very rarely in WA does something go to hearing, and then a legal outcome made. Here, everything's resolved through a court process. So planners have to be just across the Act and the LEP and the DCP and all of that. You've got to be across what's happening in the courts, which makes it much more complex than other jurisdictions. And I think, in my view, that sort of adds a lot to the complexities of planning in New South Wales.
I agree, 100%. If we can get it right from day one, that's most important. Saves a lot of time for everyone.
For sure.
Definitely. That's why we're putting on these webinars. So we're all on the same page.
Yep.
I'll just end off with just FSR. Mills Oakley have good articles on their websites with every year or so they update their interpretation of FSR as well as building height using different court cases. So that might be a point of reference for everybody here.
Sure, Mills actually make a lot of money out of their definition of FSR.
They do, and sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're right, but there's not one strict definition that we can go by. It's a case-by-case scenario, I guess. Even if it's a council where you've never worked in before, I always contact the council office and say, hey, how do you calculate it? That's one way to do it. Moving on, we've got about 4 more minutes. Are there any other questions on anything else, or comments or suggestions? No, I think everyone's they're probably already eating lunch by now.
Yeah. If there's not, Ellie, I might just end by saying, look, from my perspective, and a lot of my director colleagues around local government were really keen to build bridges with the industry. Ellie will know every time he puts up a post, or any of his colleagues put up a post on LinkedIn, there's a little bit of council bashing in there. I tend to respond to it. We are, we want to work with industry. We don't want to have a adversarial relationship. The system that we work in is geared towards that, but whatever we can do to build bridges and to work together to get outcomes, I think that's the much better approach. And that's why when Ellie invited me to be part of this, I was more than happy to be part. I think it's incumbent on all of us, not just from our side, but from your side as well, to reach out and to build those bridges. And that's the only way we can, improve our planning system.
Excellent. That's encouraging, David. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Appreciate your time, as well as everyone else here. I'll let you go off to lunch if you haven't had it already, and stay tuned for the next webinar. I'm not sure which council we'll be interviewing next, but we'll stay tuned.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, everybody.